Hey, it's Matt, your average gamer, and we are on day 3 of a build a day. That's right, we're doing a build a day until they announce DLC. So if you're interested in that, definitely hit that subscribe button. This has been pretty awesome. This is going to be a lot of fun. For this one, we're going to cover Eleonora's Poleblade. The weapon art is fantastic. We're going to also use it to proc and on-proc Frost and show and utilize basically how good the weapon is on New Game Plus 7. Since we're at the max scaling on this character here, we're going to start by taking on the Fire Giant, who has 63,000 HP. So Eleanor's Poleblade has some interesting things to it. It has a very interesting weapon art. The first one hits a bunch and can build up on consecutive attacks, which is awesome. Much like the Rivers of Blood, but this one's kind of a little bit more all over the place in terms of the animation. The second part of it, though, is a backstep. And that backstep I found to be not particularly useful. It was sort of okay, and it was better at mobs, but for bosses themselves, it's kind of oddly timed when you're going through the entire weapon art to take that backstep. In a lot of situations, I found myself getting hit. So the Fire Giant, and you're going to see a lot here because this fight goes on for about 3 minutes or so, he's very, very tough on New Game Plus 7 because he's got so much HP. But Eleanor's Poleblade, the weapon art was actually able to proc bleed at a decent rate. It does fire damage and physical damage, and it obviously procs bleed as well. And I think at 45 arcane roughly for me, I'm getting around 77 bleed buildup, which is helping the weapon art. And it is very good when you land it, but as we'll talk about as we continue here, it is a little bit fluky, especially when targets move, and it is a very long animation. I recently did a build on the Rivers of Blood, and that's in the description below. And even after the Rivers of Blood's nerf, and they nerfed it like crazy, it's still really viable for a lot of situations because the damage the weapon art does, being able to usually proc once throughout it, and also the fact that it's very easy to use. Eleanor's Poleblade is not like that. The weapon art is definitely something that you have to really get used to. It includes a jump, a whole bunch of hits pretty much everywhere, and then obviously ending with that backstep. But the question is, does it do good damage? Does it proc bleed fast? Yeah, if you land everything, it actually does proc bleed at a decent rate. And it also does a good amount of damage, and it builds up consecutive attack bonuses for your talismans and the tier that you use. And the weapon art, again, it's really fun to use. It's definitely a fun weapon art. And I'm going to show you later, as you saw at the beginning of the game, with some mobs and whatnot. We're also going to go over using another twin blade, which you can proc and on-proc Frost with Eleanor's Poleblade because of the fact that it does fire damage, which is really convenient for people who like the jump attacks with the twin blades. If you want to proc both Bleed and Frost, then yeah, it's going to help you a lot there because it'll on-proc it with the fire damage and allow you to re-proc it, and we'll go over that as well. And as far as the Fire Giant here, he had a lot of HP, but it did hold up. It took me around 3 to 5 tries for this one because I had to get used to the wild weapon art, but when I did get used to it, it was a lot of fun, did a fairly decent amount of damage, and it proc bleed a fairly good amount throughout the fight as well. One thing to note here too is if you notice, the attack patterns on the last patch sped up the two-handing of twin blades. So they actually hit faster now when you two-hand them. It's obviously still better to do the jump attacks and all that, but if you're just using one twin blade and you switch to two-handing it, it's much faster than it used to be. They sped that up, and that does help build up some bleed and whatnot, and it's also convenient if you're using something like Eleanor's Poleblade where you're just using that weapon. Even so, I would probably consistently use the weapon art because that's what we're doing this build on, and you're going to see towards the end, the build is going to be primarily built around the weapon art because that's the most fun you're going to have with this weapon. If you just want to go with a twin blade, you can go with the regular twin blade and seppuku if you really want to build up bleed, get in those jump attacks and obviously get 2 of them or even 1 and Eleanor's Poleblade on a first run. As far as this build goes though, if you're just using this weapon, you're mainly going to want to focus on the weapon art because it can be quite powerful if it's landed. It can build up bleed relatively quickly. It does a fairly decent amount of damage, and it is fun to use once you get it down. I can't say I have it down perfectly because it is a wild weapon art, but it seems like something where when you're building up the consecutive attacks, you can definitely get a lot of damage from it. You can get a lot of bleed buildup, and when landed well and utilized right, it actually does have a place even on the later journeys and New Game Plus cycles, where I've heard some people say it has a drop-off, and obviously it does feel like it has some kind of drop-off, but I still found it to be pretty good. Again, be aware that the fire giant is resisting a fairly decent amount of the fire damage, and the fact that he's got 63,000 HP since we're on journey like 14 here. So it's not the best example of it, but we did proc bleed a fairly decent amount on him. We took down a tough enemy, mainly using just the weapon art. So it does work, and it is something that you can get used to. Now, I do like the fact that you can proc and on-proc Frost, so we're going to talk about that in short order because that's really powerful. Eleonora's Poleblade is fantastic for that. As far as the Fire Giant goes, though, I wanted to use the weapon art as much as I can. Basically spam attack it, see how much damage I can get, see how easily I could take him down. And it took about 3 or 4 minutes and probably between 3 and 5 tries, which was a little bit rough. But again, it is a little bit to get used to as far as how crazy the weapon art is. So for mob control here, you can tell that it actually, you're going to see, it works quite well. It's pretty fantastic against them. You can use the weapon art on mobs. You can clear out even large groups with it. Because it's going to proc bleed a bunch, it's going to do the fire and physical damage. It's going to build up that consecutive attack bonuses and the bonuses from the Lord of Blood's Exultation. And you're going to do a lot of damage to mob-like enemies, take them down fairly quickly, and it's overall not that challenging. How is this comparing to the Rivers of Blood? I think the Rivers of Blood, and I left that build in the description below, is a lot easier to utilize, where Eleonora's Poleblade is kind of all over the place with the weapon art. Out of the two, though, I think Eleonora's Poleblade is more fun to use, but if you're going to ask which one's better to use in a simpler sense on bosses and whatnot, and even sort of on mobs, I would say the Rivers of Blood probably takes it because it's so much easier to use. For this build, we have Eleonora's Poleblade plus 10. We have the Dragon Communion Seal because it scales with Arcane, a Cold Twin Blade. We have the White Mask, Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exultation, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, and then we have the Consecutive Attack tier and the Faith tier for buffs as well. And we're building up on consecutive attack stuff, and we're also using the Shard of Alexander to boost the weapon art. Now, for the stats, I went with 45 Arcane, 50 Dexterity in total, and then we went with 50 Vigor. These stats ended up working out quite well. Even on the max scaling in the game, I was able to do a fair amount of damage. I am capping myself at 150 for the purpose of my channel on this character because it keeps it meta relevant and whatnot. But if you were to go higher, you would mainly just go up in Arcane and Dexterity, and maybe even eventually get to 60 Vigor as well. So for buffs, we're going to drink our tier, which has the consecutive attack tier in it. I think it's the Thorny tier, as well as the Faith tier, so that we can do some buffs. Then we're going to use Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and then we're going to drink our FP to fill that up and tapper that off. And then we're going to jump into the very, very fun weapon art, which has 2 parts to it that you can see there. So now we get to utilize it to proc and on-proc Frost. So we grab that Cold Twin Blade, which we're using Chilling Mist on it. We're going to activate that now. For me on Xbox, so it's Y and LB and then Y and RB back after you activate it. And then the tree avatar here is immune to bleed, but he is not immune to frost. He'll still take the frost procs and the damage. So we're going to proc and on-proc Frost on him while also utilizing Eleonora's Poleblade. And you can do this to a lot of enemies. If you're going for a Frost type build where you can proc and on-proc it, the Twin Blades are excellent for that. Each jump attack, and I would grab the Raptor's Black Feathers and the Claw Talisman for this, each jump attack is going to hit 6 times. So they're really great in terms of proccing stuff. They're fantastic for that. You're going to get a lot of Frost. And obviously the bleed on Eleonora's Poleblade is a little bit less. But even with that said, you'll get some bleed in there as well. And we were able to proc and on-proc Frost a couple of times there. And don't forget, he's immune to bleed, but with regular enemies, you're going to get the bleed procs as well as the Frost procs, which is pretty fantastic for the weapon. It's very good to utilize it that way because it does the fire damage. And that is day 3 of our build a day until they announce DLC. This is going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait. If you love overpowered PvE builds or From Software games in general, definitely check out my channel. There's a ton of awesome PvE builds on there. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll catch you guys there.